For those who don't know me, I'm assistant professor also in the Center for Migration Studies, and I would like to open now, first of all, the floor to Carlos Abauta. Before giving him the word, I just would like to announce some formalities. We have a chat where you can just type in questions if you have questions, but you can also raise your hand and when you want to ask a question, so I can unmute you from here. But please, if you're like wanting to ask something, make sure that you're also unmuted from your own side. Okay. Carlos, thank you very much. Welcome to be here in the afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I want to start by thanking the Center for Migration and Refugee Studies at the American University in Cairo for this great invitation. It's a great honor. It was planned for February of this year, but because of COVID, we had to postpone it. And I was truly looking forward to share some of these ideas because in this region of the world, in Egypt and the MENA region, I guess little is talked upon of the Latin American region, and I wanted to share some of my analysis, of my views, of the information that I have gathered, in order to try to understand, to try to see the Venezuelan migratory crisis and humanitarian crisis that has been going on for the past several years. I do have a presentation to share, so let me put that up. Okay, so as Dr. Gerda was saying, I'm going to be speaking for about 35 to 40 minutes about the Venezuelan crisis, understanding the exodus and the humanitarian costs, and then we're going to open for comments and questions and answers. I wanted to start by reading what I had posted before in the for the brochure for this seminar, which is as following. In 1998, when Hugo Chavez became president of Venezuela, more than 50% of the population lived below the poverty line. The annual inflation rate exceeded 30% and oil prices were in decline. The Bolivarian Revolution started a comprehensive reform of all government activities and allocation of state resources that resulted in food distribution programs, a publicly funded healthcare system, and inclusive education. However, since Chavez's death in 2013, the country has been in a downward spiral to present day. Critical shortages of food and medicine, social discontent, government oppression sparked one of the biggest exoduses of our time. According to the United Nations, in November 2020 of this year, there are 6.5 million Venezuelans living abroad, out of which almost 1 million are asylum seekers in different parts of the world. In this talk, we will discuss some of the historical and political causes of this crisis. We will share some thoughts on the present state of affairs, and we will analyze the humanitarian costs and migrant rights implications for host countries, international organizations, and Venezuelan people themselves. So I wanted to start by introducing, I know most of you know a lot about Venezuela, given that it has been in the news for the past few years, but let me point out some specific points on what makes Venezuela an important geopolitical actor. First, Venezuela has the biggest oil reserves in the planet. Second, Venezuela has a very important mining industry. It has coal, gold, steel, iron, aluminum, um, among other minerals. It is an important member of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC. And as of right now, if I'm not mistaken, it is the sixth largest producer of the OPEC. And of course, Venezuela has been for decades now the second largest exporter of oil to the United States after Saudi Arabia. So that makes Venezuela a very important geopolitical player, among other very important factors. So in order to understand the crisis, I have divided the recent history of Venezuela in four segments. One is before Hugo Chavez. So Hugo Chavez won the presidency, won the elections in 1999. Before Chavez, some people, I mean, and this is important in order, almost like a disclaimer, in order to understand some of the complexities of this phenomenon that is taking place in Venezuela. Before Chavez, people think of Venezuela as a rich country, as if we were a very wealthy and wealth-oriented country for all of the inhabitants in the Venezuelan territory. But as I mentioned before, as you could see, 30% of them were living under the poverty line. Social exclusion was normalized in Venezuela to the point that people that lived in Caracas or two other cities, they had a lot of resources, humongous resources, I would say, in some cases. But the rest of the population of Venezuela lived right there, right between the poverty line. So this is to say that before Chavez, things were not okay in Venezuela. Shanty towns, this is one of the most significant examples I can produce, is the shanty town that was between the international airport in Caracas and the city center. This shanty town was and is so big that that route between the international airport and the city center was and still is one of the most dangerous routes in all of Latin America, and some say in the world. Well, this speaks of poverty, of disparities, of systemic problems that were taking place way before Hugo Chavez became president. Then Hugo Chavez was president between 1999 and 2013. In 2013, he died. And some of the causes of the current crisis start taking place during the Hugo Chavez presidency, but most of them happen in this third moment, which is when Nicolas Maduro became president in 2013. And as you know, he is still president, at least according to the Venezuelan rule. There was a presidential dispute in 2019, which still continues, which has divided the world in different segments. And it has to do with the fact that Guaidó proclaimed himself president interim of Venezuela, in which case it opened up the international arena to contest the legitimacy of the Nicolas Maduro presidency. I wanted to share many pictures during this presentation. You know, as they say, one picture speaks more than 1,000 words, but also because I think it is important to, every time that we speak about migration and refugee phenomena, that we see how it affects people, migrants, refugees, not only, speaking the abstract in a scholarly way, but also see what happens to people. This is one of the many marches. And this is yet again another disclaimer that I would like to offer, because this march, some people, because we see all of this being outside of Venezuela. I do have friends, I do have people in the Venezuelan academia. I have people that travel in and out of Venezuela often, etc. And they allow me to see a different perspective of the phenomena. And this is to say that this march can be just as well anti-government as pro-government. So what we see from the outside is always framed in such a way that we see, oh, this is against the government. Look, everybody wants to overthrow the government. And it's not true. It's just simply not true. Venezuela still today has offered a direct vote of confidence for the Maduro presidency. But more than that is for a movement that is called Chavismo, right after Hugo Chavez. So more than Maduro, the main phenomena here at play is the Chavismo movement, which, as I'm saying, has at least, I would say, at least 50% of the population inside of Venezuela is still supporting it. Yet again, pictures like this can be seen in Venezuela for both sides of the story, pro-government and anti-government. So it's not, yet again, it's not true that pictures like this are only against government. They also take place in confrontations where some want to defend Chavismo and the social restructuring that still is going on to save or to create a more just society in Venezuela. So let's talk about specific points about how to understand the Exodus. I think there are 4 inflection points that I would like to talk about to understand what sparked the Exodus. First and foremost, I think it is important to talk about this one. And I think in general, many analysts neglect this point a lot, which is the so-called economic war. In 2010, when Chavez was still in power, he started, which to me, to my point of view, this is one of the biggest mistakes of Chavismo, an economic war against the empresarios, the businessmen. Chavez saw that there was no need to continue with the deregulation that was taking place, that has been taking place, forever in Venezuela, and that empresarios needed to be under a finer scrutiny within Venezuela by the government. And this had to do with the fact that they were, earning 300% profit in some products that were basic for the Venezuelan society, in which moment he started a war by regulating the prices. And this created an internal war that disrupted the supply chain in Venezuela. And this happened with 2 big segments of the supply chain, which are food and medicine. In 2015, the opposite started taking place, which is empresarios, businessmen, declare an economic war against the Maduro presidency. And so they disrupt the supply chains. And this leads to what we've seen in the news. Many images went around the world about this, that Venezuela went from this to this, right? And so again, it has to do with a disruption, a clear disruption of the supply chain within Venezuela, given the economic war that was first, um, the government against the empresarios, and then it was the government. I mean, it was the empresarios against the government. Second point is that in 2018, Maduro went for re-election and he won. This has been disputed. This has been contested. This has been very controversial because some observers claim that there were many irregularities in the process. Many don't. Yet again, this is a very polarizing topic, phenomena that we're talking about. And so the fact that the military apparatus in Venezuela supports Maduro, allow him to stay in power, but that sparked many to flee the country, as we will see in a couple of minutes. After that, after 2018, and more specifically during 2019, meaning last year, the hyperinflation has been off the rocket. I mean, the biggest in the world. Some, depending on who you see, IMF, the World Bank, the Venezuelan Central Bank, all these different organizations, depending on who is talking, we can talk about 18,000% of inflation, hyperinflation, 1 million, and there are some that say 1.8 million % of inflation. So it's really difficult to see. There are some other indexes that, like Café con Leche, which is an index in Latin America that allows one to see how much it costs to drink a coffee with milk in different countries. And like this, they determine what is the inflation rate. But anyway, what is true is that the hyperinflation is a reality, and it sparked what I would say the biggest movement of people from Venezuela. Then, as I pointed out before, the presidential dispute in 2019, when in January, when Guaidó proclaimed himself president, this started a new round of sanctions. The international arena felt, or a part of the international arena felt, that they had the legitimate power to block certain funds that Venezuela has, payment of oil shipments were blocked, etc., etc. That sparked another layer in this economic crisis that itself sparked another, an exponential, in this case, exodus from the Venezuelan people. The opposition. I think it's important to talk about the opposition because in Venezuela, as you know, Leopoldo López had two moments. In 2004, he wanted to be the mayor of Caracas, which would have been a very important point for the opposition. But he was found guilty in charges of corruption, and the courts dictated that he could not be a public servant for the rest of his life, which that point alone blocked the opposition for a while until Juan Guaidó, as I said, he became president of the National Assembly, and then started or became the leader of the opposition, to the point where in January 2019 he said, I'm going to be the interim president of Venezuela, and I will help Venezuela come to fair and transparent elections in the next few months. That didn't materialize, as I said, given the support that the Nicolás Maduro presidency has with the military apparatus in Venezuela. Let's land with some important numbers as to the exodus. These figures present some important moments that almost replicate what I just spoke about. 4 moments: 2005, 2010, 15, and 19. Look how ever since, um, let's say, the middle of the presidency of Hugo Chavez was in place, people were discontent. Some segments of society in Venezuela were discontent, and they left the country. Almost 500,000, as we can see here in the first column to the left. Almost 500,000. Now, in 2010, there isn't a big increase. There isn't a significant increase. The discontent continues. As I said, the war, the economic war against the empresarios was just taking place. In 2015, still the exo or the migration flows are not that big in comparison to half a decade prior. But we see in 2019, look, it went from 700,000 approximately to 5 million, and as we said before, 5.6 million as of today, 2020, in the next 5 years. So it increased dramatically, and we will see more in detail where these people went and what has happened to them in terms of both their livelihoods, the places where they went, and what has been the regional and international response to these migration flows. As it is expected, Venezuelans left to neighboring countries. First, you have Colombia, as you can see to the left of Venezuela, huge. There has always been some regional disputes, in terms of territory, in terms of natural resources, in terms of, you name it, but nothing that that was systemic within the cultural exchanges. People from each side were amicable. It was more between states. Now that the migration flows started increasing, Venezuelans first looked to their Colombian brothers and sisters, which, by the way, provided an ample response to take care of their basic needs right away. They also went to Ecuador, Peru, later on to Chile and Argentina. Another group went to Brazil in smaller numbers, but Brazil also opened its frontiers for the Venezuelan crisis. I would say, a group went to Central America, Mexico, and the Caribbean, as you can see more to the north. Venezuela and Panama have a historical links. They have been partners for a very long time. So many went to to Panama, but Panama is a very small country. So is Costa Rica. So is Dominican Republic. Mexico received a lot of people, and we will see it more in detail. And then another group started going to the United States in smaller numbers, about 30,000 as of today, Canada, and then Spain, Italy, Portugal. More specifically, and this is an important map and information, I want you to see the differences between 2015 and 2019. Dramatic increase. Colombia went from 48,000 to 1.6 million people. 1.6 million people. Peru went from 2,300 to 863,000 people. Chile, as you can see, a dramatic increase as well. Other places like Dominican Republic is not in this map, but it also, oh, it's here, I'm sorry. It went from 5,000 to 30,000. But this is an important map also to understand that the regional response was one of open arms, which is very important to understand the migratory processes of this crisis. All these neighboring countries opened their frontiers, their borders to Venezuelans. And they have been, of course, these are not countries known for their wealth, nor they're countries known for their lack of internal conflicts. Nonetheless, they have opened their arms to the Venezuelans' brothers and sisters. And with this in mind, international organizations have been doing an amazing work on the ground to make sure that people have at least the basic needs met. So let's understand now the humanitarian costs. This, it's a very important image, and like this you can find thousands of images online. I chose this one because it truly gives you a sense of the demographics that are fleeing Venezuela. For once, we're talking about families, entire families that flee, you know, with their children in arms. You also see men and women that flee by themselves. In some cases, they don't have the means to travel with others, so they choose a family member to travel by themselves in hopes that they would find a job outside and send remittances back home. You see that the vast majority of people that are fleeing are an economic active population, right? Most of them below 50 years of age. Also, you see that that there are no significant differences between gender. Just, you know, women as just as men have fled the country. And lastly, I want you to understand what we don't see in this picture. This also means that the elderly, you know, parents, grandparents are staying put in Venezuela. So this is creating family separation in the processes as people that I interview, Venezuelans that I interviewed in Dominican Republic, couples, young couples that left their children back home with their parents or grandparents, and they yearn to see their children. You know, new technologies allows us to see our children through telephones, but it's not the same, of course. And years pass by, and the worst part for some of these migrants, and we will see it in a couple of minutes, is that they left with the idea that they will have their economic means to be sending remittances back home, but that hasn't materialized in many cases. As I said, these neighboring countries don't have the means for, you know, job allocation and job creation and blah blah blah. So many of these people have fled just to make ends meet in their host countries, not being able to send money back home, which creates a whole different layer of complexity and humanitarian crisis. And finally, it is important to see yet again that, I'm sorry, that another group has been passing through these roads, which is unaccompanied minors, which yet again adds another layer of humanitarian crisis to the humanitarian crisis. These are some of the responses that we have seen on the ground, especially in countries that are direct neighbors with Venezuela. I would say that for the most part, migrants that have fled the country in these past 2 to 3 years have been more or less integrated in urban spaces where they find some kind of jobs, where they at least find the means to stay alive. However, since 2019 and people passing through these ports of departure increased to 8,000, 10,000, 12,000 a day, Colombia didn't have, Brazil didn't have the means to cope with an entry of these proportions. So they put um, tents in place in order to host migrants that were in transit. Um, this, again, has been done in places like Colombia, Brazil, Peru, Ecuador, but they're not meant to be um, refugee camps of any means. No, they're meant to be a transitory point of assistance for migrants that are fleeing to other destinations. This is a picture of inside of one of these tents, bed, etc. As you can see in this case, a mother with the two children. However, in some other parts, especially in mountains, and I wanted to bring this up because here in the MENA region, you don't find this to be a problem. But in the Amazonia, in the Amazon rainforest, having beds, for example, is a very dangerous matter because you have poisonous snakes, you have insects that are poisonous, etc., etc. So people in these tents have to be in hammocks, which adds a different level of complexity to deal with the magnitudes, not the numbers. You can put a whole family in one bed, but you cannot put a whole family in one hammock. So this has been a very a logistical nightmare in many points of reception of migrants. Humanitarian costs. I'm sure that I don't have to explain that Venezuela has been, for a number of decades, winning Miss Universe prizes left and right. There is a big industry inside of Venezuela for beauty and beauty international competitions, etc. Because to some standards, Venezuelan women are very beautiful, they're caring, they're nice, etc., which also has allowed for a predatory practice to be put in place in all of these reception countries that we've seen, neighboring countries, as well as in Europe, in North America, etc. And it is that these young women are offered a job that they take given the rural needs that they have and the need to send money back home. But the job materializes in human trafficking. As you can see in this picture on the left, it is a group that was taken from a Mexican cartel that was exploiting over 200 women for prostitution. I saw personally in the Dominican Republic in Santiago a local, a place where they had 58 Venezuelan women being, they were captured. They were not free to go. They were captured and they were forced to perform sex labor 24 hours a day. So this was dismantled, but it was unfortunately one of many of these places that were put in place in the Dominican Republic. But I'm saying again, this is a systemic place of the entire region. Now, these images are also very important because I was saying about, I was talking about the humanitarian crisis for people that have fled the country, but there is also a huge crisis of people that stayed. This is a shanty town that you can see on the left, bottom left, with thousands and thousands of people living in these circumstances, millions actually in the whole country. And because of the hyperinflation on the one side and lack of money on the other side, but also the economic war, the supply chain absolutely disrupted. In some cases, you just don't find cornmeal that is used to make arepas, which is a bread that is eaten on daily basis in Venezuela, cannot be found. So there is a huge disruption in eating. It goes, as I said, because of the supply chain, so it goes up and down, up and down. But in general terms, the crisis is felt throughout the entire country, except for some families that are either, the empresarios, or are families that are receiving remittances from people that left way before this 2018, 2019 crisis, or people that are military families, which is said, I couldn't find any documentation, which is said that one of the reasons why the military apparatus supports the Maduro presidency is because the presidency allowed the military apparatus to control the oil production, and they distribute the money within the country, allocating it for in different sectors. Again, I couldn't find any information regarding this claim, but I know it's a claim that has been in place for many years now. So let's talk about remittances very quickly. Does it solve the problem? Did it solve the problem? Is it what we expected? That's why I put a question mark there. And as you can see, Venezuela is the last country. This is remittances in Latin America and the Caribbean, but Venezuela is the last country with 2 asterisks, because all of these figures that you can find online and for Venezuela are nothing but estimates, given the fact that, as I said before, depending on the international organization that is claiming the data, we don't know what are the validity of this information. So in this case, people are talking about $3,400 million that were sent to Venezuela in 2019 in remittances. Just to put this in perspective, this is a huge failure in terms of seeing in remittances a possible solution to the economic crisis that is taking place within Venezuela. Huge failure. I'm going to compare very quickly. As you can see, Dominican Republic is 5th in the list, with Venezuela that is last. Venezuela, as of right now, has about 28 million people living in the country. Dominican Republic has 10, so less than half. Venezuela has about 6.5 million people that live abroad. Dominican Republic has about 1.5 million people living abroad. And Venezuela managed to send $3,400 million in remittances last year. The Dominican Republic managed to send $6,833 million in remittances last year. As you can see, it doubles the numbers of Venezuela for half of the population, less than half of the population, which also allows us to understand that if the amount of remittances is so low is because people are not finding jobs or well-paid jobs in destination countries, in host countries, which also speaks of the precarity and vulnerability that these migrants might be facing in these host countries. So let me venture to some prospective analysis on this matter. First of all, now in December, in 3 weeks' time, there will be elections, National Assembly elections. So it's like a parliamentary elections. Um, it is expected that the Maduro or the Chavismo will win these elections. This has to do with the fact, at least to my knowledge and to my analysis, it has to do with the fact that the opposition was not able to come together and unify one front against the Nicolás Maduro presidency or the Chavismo movement in general. Whereas, on the other hand, I just read yesterday that one of the most important leftish groups in Venezuela is going to join interests with the Maduro presidency and the Maduro group, in which case the elections might be truly geared towards the left and towards a continuation of the Maduro presidency, the Maduro policies, et cetera, et cetera. Biden's administration, when January comes, I think might be a very important point of inflection. It is obvious that the sanctions that have been put in place by the US, by the UN, by Europe, have created a destabilization in the region, in the country, but in the region of catastrophic dimensions. This, at some point, will reach and is reaching the United States, Mexico, the United States, and Europe, as we have seen with Spain, Italy, Portugal, and it will continue to do so. So I think Biden and also representing the interest of the EU and the UN will start a process of negotiations with the Nicolás Maduro presidency in order to soften the sanctions in exchange for the inclusion of the opposition in the government. Again, this is my own perception, but I think it is the most likely scenario with a Biden's administration. The military support will continue as long as there are no clear interventions, either by Russia or China on the one hand, or by the US, the UN on the other hand. So if everything continues as is, the Nicolás Maduro presidency will continue with the military support. The long-term sustainability of what's going on in Venezuela is, I mean, it's unsustainable. This cannot continue for much longer. Countries of destination are at their maximum capacity. That's why now these migratory routes continue expanding themselves, ever so south, in the case of now reaching Chile and Argentina, or north, now reaching Mexico in more numbers, which will continue to the US and Canada. So it's not sustainable. Something has to change. And in terms of the international pressure, is hard to say, because as you can see in this map, the world has divided itself between what you would expect from a leftish against a right-wing scenario, which is Venezuela has the support of Russia and China, Bolivia, Nicaragua, Cuba. And Bolivia, Nicaragua, and Cuba are not, they're smaller players, but they're important players, especially now with COVID-19. Cuba has sent many doctors to Venezuela to help out. Nicaragua is a symbolic player, but it's also accepting Venezuelans and providing help. And so does Bolivia. And the OPEC, give and take, is just has try to maintain itself as neutral in case that something dramatic changes, that they can continue working with the Venezuelan government. Russia and China are increasingly providing more help and more investment in Venezuela. Final remarks. As of the beginning of the talk, I think it is important to understand that macroeconomic indicators are not the best means to understand what is Chavismo, what is this movement, what has meant for the local population. And in general terms, macroeconomic indicators are not the best means to understand the migratory crisis in some cases. There are other indicators that have to be taken into account. The regional response has been absolutely outstanding. Colombia being the #1 country that has hosted the most Venezuelans in need, followed by Peru, Ecuador, the Dominican Republic, in Central America, now Chile. It has been an amazing response to the brothers and sisters of Venezuela fleeing the country. Numbers keep on increasing. As I said, it's not sustainable. Numbers keep increasing, and they're now reaching the point where countries cannot take more Venezuelan migrants at all. And finally, again, as a means to understand truly what has been the regional response, look at these numbers. Almost 2,500,000 permits, residency permits, work permits, temporary stay permits have been granted to the Venezuelan population in the region so that they can stay, so that they can work, so that they don't have to feel persecution by the state because they are irregular in the country, etc., etc. It has been a very interesting and an important response by the region. And however, this is not to say that the crisis is at all under control. Quite the opposite. I think the challenge, in a way, is just beginning to show its dimensions. There are 6.5 million people in need, out of which only 2.2 have been reached. The rest, over 4 million people, are in crisis. Crisis in terms of food security, health. Now the pandemic just came to put another layer of complexity to this problem. Integration, education, shelter, transportation, etc., etc. I mean, it's far from over. In a way, it feels that it's just the beginning. So with this, I want to end, and I want to thank you for your attention. And now let's welcome some comments and rounds of questions and see if I can answer some of them. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carlos. Can you stop sharing?
Absolutely. Let me see.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Carlos. This was a very differentiated and unpolarized discussion on Venezuela, and I learned actually some new details on the crisis. Thank you very, very much. It was very interesting, and I have already 2 people. There was Maria Fernanda Valencia. She raised her hand already half an hour before. Do you have a question? Once, if yes, I can just unmute you, and you have to unmute yourself. No, she's not there. Yes. Can you hear me? She is not there anymore, I think.
Yeah.
She's not there anymore. She left probably.
Okay.
No, Maria, there was, okay. So then there was Maitza, who had a question. Maitza,
Yeah,
I
sure.
think you can, yes, please.
Yeah. Hi, thank you very much for the very interesting presentation. For me, it was very, very informative. So
Thank
I have the question is that from your presentation, it's very clear that the influx or the movement is predominantly economic movement. It's for economic reasons. There might be other people who are fleeing political fear or political persecution, but it's predominantly an economic movement. So I'm wondering two things. One, particularly those who are not fleeing to the neighboring country, because in one of your graphs, you also the numbers in Europe, Canada, and the US is not insignificant.
Correct.
How are these people? What are they doing there? Are they applying for asylum? Because definitely they don't fall under the 1951 convention.
Correct.
The second thing is that you mentioned that those who fled to the neighboring countries are fleeing as urban migrants, but I saw the picture of UNHCR tents.
Mhm.
So the assistance that is even provided not as refugee camps, but provided temporary, it's provided by UNHCR. So it's just interesting to see how UNHCR is involved. Even on UNHCR website, I see Venezuela mentioned as a group.
Yes. Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
so
Good
your
question.
comment.
Wait. Okay, maybe there's no other question at the moment. So please, Carlos, maybe
Yes.
you can answer.
Yes. Thank you, Maisa. Thank you. Very, very interesting and very relevant questions. UNHCR has worldwide has registered 890,000 asylum requests. Almost 900,000. It's a lot. However, I think many of these people will have very difficult times to during the refugee determination status to prove that they were being persecuted by the state. Many of the early people that left were granted asylum in different countries, the U.S., Canada, Mexico, but Europe. But this was during the time that people were fleeing for political reasons because they didn't agree with the Hugo Chavez presidency and then the Maduro. But this was early on, so there was an opposition movement that was clear in place. It had many faces, and many of these people did have to go. In some cases, not because the state was behind their persecution, but because other people from the Chavismo movement were, trying to attack entire families, houses, etc. So they had to flee. The government might have tried to protect them, but it's not clear because this was a big movement. And as I said, there was a moment in which was literally like 50% of the population against the other 50. So I would say that these people, yes, they're economic migrants, many of them. The opposition, as I said, doesn't have a clear north right now. So it would be hard to prove that you fled the country because of persecution, of fear of persecution. UNHCR, what they did, knowing that there is an upheaval, which is clear, and as I said in the presentation, sometimes what we see in the news can be anti-government, without a doubt, but sometimes it's pro-government. Nonetheless, it is brothers and sisters confronting brothers and sisters. In some cases, these protests end in tens of deaths, people that were stabbed, et cetera, people that disappeared, et cetera. I mean, it's difficult and it's real. So the UNHCR understands that many of this is not a state persecution per se. Nonetheless, it's a humanitarian crisis that has to be dealt with. So they created a new what do you call this? A new instrument to deal with this, which is called R4V, Response for Venezuelans. And this is an UNHCR response. It is official, and they're channeling all of the resources to help with the humanitarian crisis in different parts of the world, especially in neighboring countries, as I said. But it is official, nonetheless, is not refugee per se, but because of the humanitarian crisis that has to be dealt with. I don't know if this answers the...
Yeah, I think it's very interesting because the case in itself bring into question the problem with the 1951 convention and the need to expand it, because the numbers you're talking about, huge. And now the number of Venezuela, it comes second after the Syrian. So in terms of number, this is, so this brings into question.
Very soon it will surpass Syria.
Exactly. So it's good to know that UNHCR is like going beyond the 1951 convention, but it really brings into question the importance of expanding the convention.
Yes, and this I have to say, from what I could see, it's rather a response of many different international organizations that have come together. So you have UNHCR, IM, the International Organization for Migrations. You have different ones working together to provide the assistance that is desperately needed in some of these regions. As I said, imagine seeing overnight 8,000 new people coming to your camp, to your city, to your... It's interesting to see that, yeah, as you said, they're going beyond their mandate to accommodate the needs of these people. Thank you for this observation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I leave it to receive the other questions.
Okay, there are some questions in the chat. I'm going to read them. I also have a question which probably fits to one of the questions from the chat. First, the one observation from the chat, it is from Alejandro. It is important to mention that the last political elections, only 10 to 15% of the population have voted. People do not attend political events because they do not have any confidence in the system. And then there's Catarina Vizcaño. She says, Colombia has issued many work and residence permits, but the economic and political situation there is not getting much better. And since Duque took office, Spain has also created special easing for visa for Venezuelans to migrate to Spain. However, how do you see the effects of COVID on Venezuelan migration in Colombia and in Spain? My question actually was adding to it, if I can just jump in here. I've been reading recently an article by a Colombian researcher on this topic, and also I have been last year talking to friends in Brazil on the Venezuelan crisis, of course. And you're right, of course they were like very welcoming and open, the government, but at the same time there is a really huge backlash, like right-wing groups in both countries are taking advantage of it and invest a xenophobic phenomena. Do you know anything more about it? I was just like interested in it.
Mm-hmm.
And then there is, maybe you just answered, Mitru Escalona. Good afternoon, excellent conference. It was very constructive for me. I have two private questions to transmit to Carlos Abanza. Is it possible to have a presentation? For me, it is very important to take contact with him. If it's possible to have his email, please. I'm Venezuelan, an academic composer living in Paris. In this moment, I'm working on a new piece about the Venezuelan exodus. My email is Mitru. I'm going to save the email properly. I'm going to send it to
Excellent, and I will send her an email. Excellent, thank you.
Okay, that's it so far, I think.
Thank you very much. Wow, very interesting. Let's see. It is true. It is true. There is, by the way, for those who would like to pursue reading about the Venezuelan crisis, there is a very interesting website that I would like to share with you that provides news. And so it's important to see not only, what one gets from CNN, BBC, etc., but also some internal analysis, and then you can do with the analysis what you will. But it is called Venezuela Analysis, one word, only one A. So Venezuela Analysis, venezuelaanalysis.com. It's very interesting what they provide in terms of analysis. People like Chomsky and other geopoliticians have learned from it a lot, and they recommend it. So I was doing some reading yesterday on it. It is true that that for a big section of the population in Venezuela, there is no political confidence. They feel that there is no legitimacy to any political process within Venezuela. So this sentiment is real, is backed up by a lot of events that have taken place. However, I think it is also important to know that there is another segment of the population that believes in the representation of Chavismo for these people. It's a pity that I wasn't able to show some of these pictures and take note of the detail. But I was watching last week a TED talk of a girl that wants to analyze the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela and the migration flows. And she's talking about, how unfair the government is and how awful the government is and blah, blah, blah. And then she starts saying, well, my grandmother, who wanted to stay in the country, she thought that she wants to see this process change. Then one day she said to the bodyguards, no, I'm not going to stay. I'm going to go. So it's interesting because the phrase she didn't almost want to say, people that are wealthy in Venezuela and have stayed in the country do have a really hard time thinking of representation, thinking of democratic terms, of fair elections, of et cetera, et cetera. However, this other segment of the population truly believe in Chavismo. They happen to be darker. They happen to be from the outskirts. They happen to be people that for decades were non-existent to the Venezuelan government. There were no schools, no hospitals, no investment of any kind for their, for their growth. And now, with Chavismo in place, they have found, a big segment of the population has found that they have a government that has them in mind. Again, I know this is a very polarizing topic, but it's also, it's also true that some people do believe in the electoral processes of Venezuela, but the other half doesn't. So it's true. Now, COVID and Venezuela. I hope I answered Alejandro's question. Or the comment. It's difficult, and I do know that he's right, but I do also want to advocate for the other half of the population that believes that there is some representation going on in these elections. COVID-19, it's absolutely necessary to see how COVID is going to affect all of these processes of migrant reception for these host countries. Right now, I was in the process of trying to see if I could win a consultancy by IOM in order to understand the implications of COVID-19 in human mobility specifically with Venezuelans. So IOM is investing a lot of money now to understand what has to be put in place in terms of public policies and international assistance in order to help these people that have fled the country and still people that continue living the country on a daily basis. So it is truly unknown. What I can see is that countries can continue doing what they have been doing in the past, which is you accept X amount of people, you put them in quarantine, you provide tests, you see who is positive, who is negative, and then you start admitting people little by little as they show negative results in their tests. So, the logistics behind it don't have to be, off the roof. Is very simple. Now, the political will has to be there. I would say locally for the Venezuelan population, many of these people are well educated. They can take on low skilled jobs and high skilled jobs in many cases. So I think the reception for many countries is not as harsh as it would be for other populations, generally speaking. Conflict with Venezuela, yes. Venezuela with Colombia and with other countries, even Ecuador, etc. 2-3 years ago, there was a lot of conflict actually, as people were beginning to flee in mass numbers. There was a lot of conflict because they were competing for local resources. And there is a big literature actually that started appearing on this topic, people conducting research, documentaries that were being filmed. However, over the past year, I think many of these conflicts have developed into a more articulate response, in the sense of now you cannot stay, you are in transit. So you're not going to be competing for local resources. You're going to stay here overnight for 1 week, etc. But you're leaving. And again, UNHCR, IOM, etc., has been helping people to move along. So I think conflicts are diminishing. However, I wouldn't bet on it. I think that what we saw 2-3 years ago has diminished, but I haven't read a lot about it as of today. But thank you so much for the questions. Very interesting. And now I have more homework to do on this topic. Gerda, I don't know if you can hear me, but I cannot hear you right now.
Oh, I'm sorry. I have to unmute myself. I'm sorry. There was Anthony who was raising his hand, but I think he had to leave. Thank you, Carlos, for the informative and well-structured presentation. I have one question regarding the European response towards the humanitarian crisis. Is the humanitarian aid the only solution offered, or is there any inclusive program, burden sharing, or further resettlement quota to some European countries' advocacy and for more political stability in the country? There's another one by Anthony. Good morning, everyone. I'm a Venezuelan student. I was the president of OBE, a Bolivarian student organization. Until last year, I struggled with some students about what we as students can do in order to create new strategies for all of us to fight with the economic and social situation in our country. And then there was there's another question by Laura Silva. Thank you thank you for your presentation. I want to hear your perspectives on recent called Venezuelan diaspora, the possibility of organizations of Venezuelan support, and the visibility of these organizations. I'm Venezuelan musician scholar in the United States and currently conducting research on this topic. Thank you. I leave my email here. Muchas gracias por la presentación. Carlos from Catherine Vizcalino.
Wow, that last question, I mean, many of these questions would take another presentation by itself. The whole thing of the Venezuelan diaspora is huge. It's a huge topic. It has been very active politically, not only in the US, but regionally, in Europe as well. So it's a huge topic. I am afraid that we don't have the time to give a more comprehensive answer, given the fact that in a few minutes we have to end. But with the email, I can be in contact with Catherine. However, I do want to say that it is, that yes, a response has to be created, a response with different strategies for different scenarios. As I said, I do believe, and I would claim that I'm not the only one that sees that the Biden administration will create the scenario for the political crisis, the economic crisis in Venezuela to succeed, in exchange for opposition leaders to be part of the government, to call for possibly earlier elections, with more people observing the elections, et cetera, et cetera. I think it is in return for a loosening of the sanctions that are in place right now. I think it is going to happen, but this also needs a response and clear strategies to deal with different scenarios. As I said, IOM right now is investing a lot of money, but it's not the only international organization investing money in providing analysis for different scenarios and different responses. I think burden sharing is one of them that has to be put in place, but has to be put in place now contemplating other countries. As I said, neighboring countries are at the end of their capacity. These are countries that historically have had a lot of difficulties, economic difficulties and social difficulties and political difficulties. So right now they have, and don't take me wrong, and I see now where Gerda's question was going to, it has not been an open arms scenario without conflict. It's been difficult. Many negotiations have taken place. Many conflicts have arisen, given the complexity and the numbers of this crisis. However, yes, the diaspora could be a very important element that can articulate a response in different countries, given the fact that there are many Venezuelans in all of these countries, many of them very well educated, with an important political capital. However, one of the difficulties about the diaspora articulating a response is that many of them have taken one political side without understanding or wanting to include the other side. I have tried, as you can see, I have tried to stay neutral in this sense and present data and present some analysis, but not taking sides, because I know that the complexity is beyond my means for analysis. But yeah, so to answer the questions, I do think that the diaspora could play a central role in articulating an international response. It has to go through burden sharing. It cannot continue we cannot continue allowing the neighboring countries to sustain all of this. It's not possible. Different strategies have to be put in place, again, not only for one scenario, but for multiple scenarios, in order to be ready to see when one materializes over the other. And the European response, that would take another presentation, but the European response has been fairly weak. But we know that Europe in general has a policy of no entry, right? Not only for refugees, but for humanitarian crises around the world. However, many Venezuelans, you probably know this, but if you don't, I will say many Venezuelans are, first generation, second generation of, Spanish, Italian, German, Portuguese migrants. So many of these have been able to enter Europe, not because Europe opened up itself to this migration, but because they have the legal means to do so, and they have brought, family reunification, et cetera, et cetera. They have brought other family members with themselves. So Europe could be doing a lot more, and so does the US. To answer the questions.
Okay. We have 2 comments. Maybe I'm just reading them, and I think we are almost at our end. I think we have to finish in 5 minutes. There's one from Katharine. If I may leave my email as well, I'm interested in the international response to Venezuelan migration and how the current situation may affect international migration pact, e.g. UNHCR modification going forward. Thank you. I've been sending you this email, this comment. Good morning from Mexico. I would like to help in any way that I could do. If from here, congratulations to Aveniba Fernanda. And I think that's it. Thank you, Carlos, very, very much.
Thank you so much, all of you. Thank you for the CMRS for having me. It's been a wonderful experience. Thank you for all the attendees for taking the time for the amazing questions. Again, I have homework now here to continue with this research and hopefully probably write something about it and publish something about it. I just left my contact information, my email with the chat. And thank you once again, everyone, for your kind attention and your comments and questions.
Okay, thank you very much, and hope to see you all again in our next session, in our next webinar. For now, I'm just searching for the topic. One moment. We are going to have in 2 weeks. We're going to have our next webinar, and actually, I don't find the announcement anymore here. Yes. However, I'm sorry, I don't find the announcement, but I know that in 2 weeks we have our next webinar. It's by Nada Al-Kouri. It's a new faculty member at the AUC, at the Center for Migration Studies. She's a researcher, and she has been doing research on rural migration in Egypt. Besides that, please, if you don't know it, follow us on Facebook. Here in Facebook, we will announce all our lectures, our reports, whatever, and our activities. I wish you all a good evening, good afternoon, and
good morning.
Hope to see you. And good morning, yes, and good morning to Mexico, I think. And see you all, hopefully, in 2 weeks again. Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.